When you open a bottle of olive oil or pour a glass of wine, have you ever stopped to think about its story? Because it turns out that story is way, way older than you probably imagine. We're not talking centuries here, we're talking thousands of years. It's an epic tale of how these two simple fruits helped build empires, survive climate change, and pretty much lay the groundwork for civilization as we know it.
All right, so how in the world do we know all this? Well, to piece together this huge 6,000-year history, a team of archaeologists went big. I mean, they didn't just look at a few old pots. They sifted through evidence from more than 330 different archaeological sites. And get this, they analyzed almost 4 million individual seed fragments. That is just a mind-boggling amount of data.
So that's the big question, isn't it? Think of what we're doing here as a kind of archaeological detective story. We're on the hunt for clues. But our clues aren't fingerprints or DNA. Nope, they're millions of tiny, charred, ancient seeds and bits of charcoal. And believe it or not, they're going to help us solve a mystery that spans millennia.
Okay, so before we jump into the timeline, we gotta understand the evidence. There are basically two main types of clues these detectives are looking at, and they tell totally different stories about what was going on.
This is so important to get right. If archaeologists find a bunch of ancient olive pits, what does that tell you? It tells you people were eating olives. It's kind of like finding an empty pizza box in the trash. You know for sure someone ate pizza, right? But you have no idea if they made it themselves or ordered it from a place miles away. But if you find charcoal from burned olive wood or grapevine prunings, aha, that's different. That's like finding the flour receipts for the pizza dough. That's proof of production. It means they were growing the stuff right there, on site. And that distinction, it's absolutely crucial for figuring all this out.
All right, so now that we know what to look for, let's go way back to the very beginning. Where do our two main characters, the olive and the grape, first show up on the scene?
So check this out. The evidence points to the first real olive cultivation happening way back around 5000 BC in the southern Levant. That's basically modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. Grapes came a little later. But what's really wild is that people were growing olive orchards for almost 2,000 years before the first big cities even started popping up. This wasn't just some hobby. This was a foundational piece of their society, long before urbanization.
And that's the key right there. These plants weren't just about making new food, they were a brand new economic engine, one that was about to completely change the ancient world. So, how did they do that? Well, first off, think about where you can grow things. Grain needs nice, flat, fertile land. But olives and grapes, they actually thrive on rocky hillsides, land that's pretty much useless for anything else. So right away, you've just massively expanded your food-producing territory. This created a huge surplus of stuff like oil and wine, which are packed with calories and, super importantly, are easy to store and trade. This new wealth fed more people. It let societies get more complex with different social classes, and it became the backbone for huge trade networks with superpowers like ancient Egypt.
And you can literally see this on the archaeological map. For thousands of years, the Levant was the undisputed champion of olive and grape production. The amount of evidence there is just off the charts compared to, say, Mesopotamia, where they were focused on totally different crops. You could almost say the Levant became the Silicon Valley of ancient fruit cultivation. It was the place to be.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The story isn't just one long, happy period of growth. Like any good drama, this one has a villain. And in this story, the great villain was a volatile, changing climate that kept threatening to bring the whole system down.
The first big hit came around 2200 BC. Scientists call it the 4.2 mega event, and it was basically a period of intense, widespread drought that lasted for a long time. And the archaeological record is crystal clear. As the climate got drier, the evidence for olive and grape farming just plummets. And it's no coincidence that at the exact same time, we see a major collapse in the population. The system was fragile.
Then, about 1,000 years later, around 1200 BC, another crisis hits. You might know this as the Late Bronze Age collapse. But this time, the story is a lot more complicated. We see evidence of people migrating, ancient texts that talk about enemies coming in and burning vineyards on purpose, and a massive reorganization of society. Some people just gave up on fruit farming and switched to herding animals instead. It was a time of total chaos. But out of that chaos, new powers started to rise. And this brings us to the climax of our story, the arrival of a new superpower, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a military machine with, let's say, very particular tastes.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The Assyrians, they just weren't that into olive oil as a food. The records show they mostly used it for cosmetics and stuff. But wine? Oh, they loved wine. It was a high-status drink for royalty and the elites. And this one cultural preference completely changed the economy of the whole region. The imperial thirst for wine created a boom in vineyards, with trade routes shifting to supply the heart of the empire. And that massive demand led to intense specialization. At the height of Assyrian power, the Levant basically became a specialized production zone. They were growing cash crops like grapes and olives specifically for the huge imperial market. They weren't just farming to feed themselves anymore. They were farming for an empire. But this created a really weird puzzle for the archaeologists. Remember our production evidence, the charcoal? Well, even in areas that were clearly massive wine producers, scientists found very, very little charcoal from grapevines, especially when you compare it to the mountains of olive wood charcoal they were finding. What was going on? This is a great example of how science works. The researchers came up with a few possible explanations. 1. Ancient art shows that sometimes people grew vines up trees, which would make them really hard to prune. 2. Maybe the clippings were just too useful to burn. You could use them to make baskets or as compost. And 3. It could just be a preservation thing. Tiny little grape twigs might just burn up completely into ash, leaving nothing behind for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. So, after this incredible 6,000-year journey of booms and busts, climate change, and shifting empires, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting legacy of these two plants? Honestly, I think the researchers behind this study said it best. These weren't just foods. They were drivers of change. They fueled economies. They brought different cultures together through trade, and they pushed societies to specialize, which is one of the key things you need to build a complex civilization.
So what does all this mean for you and me? Well, the next time you're in your kitchen and you reach for that bottle of olive oil,
Just take a second, because you're not just holding a cooking ingredient. You are literally tasting the end result of a 6,000-year story of human innovation, crisis, and survival. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other incredible stories are hiding in the food we eat every single day?